I never expected one sentence to change everything. She looked at me, steady and unflinching, and said, "You can walk away now, but you'll regret it forever." In that moment, I knew I was standing on the edge of a choice that would shape the rest of my life. I still remember the first time I saw her. It wasn't dramatic or planned. No grand setting, no reason to think my life was about to shift in some subtle but permanent way. I had ducked into a small bookshop at dusk, mostly to get out of the drizzle that had started falling outside. The place was warm and quiet, carrying that familiar scent of paper and ink mixed with a faint trace of old wood. She was standing by one of the tall shelves, head slightly tilted, fingertips brushing the spines, as though she wasn't just looking for a book, but listening for the one that might call her name. Her hair fell in soft waves around her face, touched by just enough silver to give her a kind of graceful authority. And when she glanced sideways, catching me staring longer than I should have, her eyes held mine in a way that made the air feel heavier. I mumbled something about the rain, about how I hadn't meant to intrude. She smiled faintly, the corners of her lips curving with a practiced ease that couldn't quite hide the weariness beneath. "You're not intruding," she said softly, her voice low and even, carrying a warmth that settled in my chest before I realized it. We talked about the books in front of us. It was nothing, titles, authors, little passing remarks, but the way she spoke made everything feel weightier, as though behind each word there was something left unsaid. I found myself listening more to the rise and fall of her tone than the sentences themselves, watching the way she gestured lightly with her hands, careful but expressive. At one point, she handed me a book she thought I might like. Our fingers touched briefly, not long, just a passing moment, but even that fleeting brush seemed to leave a trace of warmth against my skin. I told myself, I imagined it, that I was reading too much into something ordinary, yet the impression lingered as though she had pressed a secret into my hand instead of just a novel. I noticed little things. The faint perfume she wore, subtle and floral, mixing with the smell of rain that clung to her coat. The way she paused before answering a question, as though choosing her words with care. The quiet intelligence in her eyes that made me feel, strangely, both observed and understood. When she finally moved to leave, she gave me a parting smile that was polite but not dismissive. It carried a suggestion of possibility, as though she was leaving the door of this new connection slightly ajar. I stood there long after she had gone, holding the book she'd handed me, trying to explain to myself why such a simple meeting felt like something more. Looking back, I realized it wasn't just her presence that stirred me. It was the contrast between her calm composure and the small, almost hidden flickers of vulnerability I caught when her eyes softened or her smile faltered. That was the first spark, the quiet beginning I never saw coming. I told myself it was coincidence, that I had no reason to return to that little bookshop so soon after our first meeting. But the truth is, some part of me was restless, drawn back as if her presence still lingered there, waiting. The rain had cleared by then, leaving the evening air sharp and fresh, the streetlights glowing against slick pavement. I pushed the door open, and the familiar chime above announced my arrival. I didn't expect her to be there, but she was, standing in almost the same place as before, head bent slightly as she flipped through the opening pages of a hardcover. This time, she noticed me first. A small smile curved her lips, softer than before, as if she remembered me too. "Back again?" she asked, her voice carrying that same warmth that seemed to settle under my skin. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. I guess I wasn't finished browsing. She gave a quiet laugh, low and melodic, then tilted her head toward the corner seating area, a pair of worn leather chairs facing each other near the window. Without quite knowing how, I found myself following her there, as if her invitation didn't need words. We sat, the silence between us unforced, filled by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of pages. Our conversation picked up more easily this time. She asked me what I was reading, and I admitted that half the time I picked books not for the story, but for the feeling of escape. Her eyes softened at that, and she nodded. "Escaping," she said, almost to herself. "That's something I understand." There was a pause, And then she shared more little pieces of her life she hadn't owed me. She talked about long dinners that ended with her washing dishes alone, about birthdays that came and went quietly, about how people assumed she was strong because she carried herself that way. But in her voice, I heard the trace of something else. The weight of silence, the ache of time passing too quickly. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. And in my stillness, I think she found a kind of safety. Her words came slower, deeper, as if she hadn't meant to say them but couldn't quite stop. At one point, she leaned forward, brushing an invisible speck of dust from her sleeve. The motion brought her close enough that I caught the faint perfume she wore again, mixing with the earthy scent of books. My hand rested on the armrest between us, and for a heartbeat, her fingers grazed mine as she adjusted. It was nothing deliberate, or maybe it was. Either way, the touch sent a quiet jolt through me, and I knew she felt it too from the way her breath caught before she pulled back. When it was time to leave, she stood slowly, as if reluctant to break whatever fragile thread had formed between us. Her hand lingered briefly on my arm as she thanked me for listening, just a gentle press, but it carried more than words could. And as she walked toward the door, the chime sounding once again, I realized it wasn't coincidence that had brought me here. I had come back because something in her, in the way she smiled, the way she let slip glimpses of her loneliness, had already taken root in me. It was a week later when we met again. Not in the bookshop this time, but in a quiet cafe tucked away on a side street. She was already seated by the window when I walked in, a half-empty cup of tea in front of her, her gaze fixed on the people passing by outside. When she noticed me, her face softened in a way that told me she wasn't surprised to see me there, almost as if she'd been waiting, even if she wouldn't admit it. I ordered coffee and joined her, sliding into the seat across from hers. The space felt different from the bookshop, warmer, more intimate, with the faint clatter of dishes and the hum of soft music in the background. Our conversation began lightly, with easy exchanges about the weather, the books we were reading, and the little quirks of the city. But as the minutes stretched on, I sensed a shift in her. Her posture, usually so composed, slouched ever so slightly. Her fingers circled the rim of her teacup again and again, like she was working up the courage to say something. Finally, she exhaled, a sound almost like surrender. "You know," she began, her voice softer than before, "people always assume I'm fine. I've got everything together. And maybe I let them believe it, because it's easier than explaining." She paused, eyes lowering to her hands. "But sometimes the silence in my house feels so heavy, it's like it presses against me. I make dinner, I pour a glass of wine, and there's no one across the table. Just me." Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I just let it be, because it felt like she hadn't spoken those truths aloud in a very long time. She gave a small, shaky laugh, trying to brush it off. "Listen to me, telling a near stranger all of this. I must sound ridiculous." "You don't," I said gently. "You sound honest." Her eyes flicked up to mine then, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability she usually kept tucked away. Not weakness, but something far more human, a longing to be understood. We sat side by side after that, our words slowing. At one point, our shoulders touched, lightly at first, then more firmly as we leaned just enough to feel the other's presence. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even acknowledged. But I felt the warmth of her through the fabric of her sleeve, and I could sense the slight quickening of her breath. The closeness lingered for several minutes, neither of us moving away. And in that quiet, I realized something. This wasn't just about chance meetings anymore. She was letting me see her, piece by piece, past the polished surface. And instead of frightening me, it drew me in deeper. By the time we left the cafe, the night air cool against our skin, something had shifted. She had shown me her loneliness. And, unknowingly, she had given me a piece of trust one didn't want to lose. It happened on an evening when the weather turned quickly. We'd met again, not by arrangement, but by that strange pull that kept leading us into each other's orbit. This time, it was after a long walk through the park. The sky had been clear when we started, But by the time we reached the far edge, the clouds had gathered, heavy and dark, carrying the sharp scent of rain. She looked up at the sky, shaking her head with a small smile. "We should probably head back," she said. But even as she spoke, the first drops began to fall, dotting the pavement and speckling her coat. We hurried beneath a row of tall trees, their branches offering only partial shelter. The rain thickened quickly, soft at first, then steady, the sound like 1,000 small drumbeats on the leaves above us. She laughed, really laughed, a sound that surprised me with its brightness. For a moment, she looked younger, freer, her hair dampening at the edges, strands clinging to her face. I slipped off my jacket without thinking and held it out. "Here, you'll get soaked." She hesitated, eyes flicking from the jacket to me, then shook her head. "You'll need it." I stepped closer, draping it around her shoulders before she could refuse again. My hands brushed against her arms as I settled the fabric around her, and the contact made my chest tighten. Her skin was cool from the rain, but beneath the chill, I felt warmth, steady and alive. She glanced up at me then, her eyes catching the faint glow of the street lamp nearby. There was a stillness in that look, as if neither of us was sure whether to move closer or step away. The rain fell harder around us, but beneath the trees, the world had narrowed to just the two of us and the quiet pulse of our breathing. Her hand lifted almost absently, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Then, as though the motion carried her further than she intended, her fingers touched the back of my hand. Lightly, tentatively, but they stayed there. I didn't move, afraid that even the smallest shift would break the spell. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough I was certain she could feel it. The touch grew steadier, her fingers sliding into mine. Not fully, just the tips resting against my palm, but enough to make the air between us hum with unspoken meaning. The world around us blurred into background. The hiss of rain, the faint hum of passing cars, the smell of wet earth rising from the ground. She drew in a quiet breath and gave a small shake of her head, as if amused by her own boldness. But she didn't pull away. When the rain finally softened and we began walking again, her hand brushed mine once more, lingering a second too long before slipping free. Neither of us mentioned it, but I carried the weight of that touch with me, etched into my memory as something small, fragile, and impossibly important. It was the first real proof of what I had begun to suspect, that whatever existed between us wasn't just in my imagination. It was real, and it was growing. The days after the rain lingered in my mind like a dream I wasn't ready to wake from. That moment, her fingers brushing mine, the warmth of her hand in the cool night, had replayed over and over. It wasn't just a touch. It was a question neither of us had dared to voice. When we met again, there was something different in the air. She was quieter, more guarded, her smile tempered by hesitation. We sat across from each other in a cafe, the same worn chairs, the same corner table. But where our words had flowed easily before, this time they caught and snagged, as if both of us were thinking too much about what shouldn't be said. At last, she sighed and set her cup down. "You're young," she said softly, not quite looking at me. "Too young to get tangled in something like this." Her words should have stung, but they didn't. Instead, I felt the weight behind them. Not dismissal, but fear. Fear of judgment, of missteps, of opening a door she wasn't sure she had the right to open. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "And you're afraid of what people would think." Her eyes flicked up to mine, then sharp and searching. She didn't answer, but the silence was enough. There was a push and pull in every glance, every gesture. At times, she let herself relax, her laughter breaking through like sunlight after clouds. Then, just as quickly, she would retreat, her hands folding in her lap, her eyes drifting to the window, as if reminding herself of the space she thought should exist between us. One evening, when we walked side by side down a narrow street, she stopped abruptly. I turned, confused, until she raised her hand to my cheek. Her touch was gentle, her palm warm against my skin. The world seemed to pause. "You make it too easy," she whispered. "Too easy to forget everything I've built to protect myself. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, she pulled her hand back as if burned. She stepped away, shaking her head, her eyes shimmering with something between longing and regret. The space between us felt unbearable in that moment. I wanted to close it, to take her hand again, to prove that whatever fears she carried, I wasn't going anywhere. But I didn't. I let her retreat because I understood, maybe better than she knew, how much courage it had taken for her to reach out at all. That night, as I lay awake replaying her words, I realized the depth of our conflict wasn't about age or even circumstance. It was about trust. She had built her life around walls meant to keep her heart safe, and I was standing just outside them, waiting, hoping she might let me in. The next day, the rain had passed, leaving the air cool and clear, washed of its heaviness. We walked along the riverside, the late afternoon sun glinting off the water in fractured silver. The path was quiet except for the crunch of gravel beneath our shoes and the occasional rustle of reeds swaying with the breeze. It should have felt peaceful, and in a way it did. Yet beneath the calm, there was something unsettled between us, something unspoken, waiting. She walked just ahead of me at first, her hands tucked lightly into her coat pockets. When she slowed her pace so that we walked side by side, I felt the quiet weight of her presence, the nearness of her shoulder brushing mine from time to time. But her silence was different that day, not the comfortable kind we'd shared before. This one carried questions, doubts. Finally, she stopped by the railing that overlooked the water. Her gaze followed the current, as if she were searching for answers in its steady flow. "Do you ever think about," she hesitated, drawing in a breath, "about how this looks? To other people, I mean." The words hung there, fragile but heavy. I leaned against the railing beside her, watching the river ripple past. "Of course I think about it," I admitted. "I know people might see us and wonder, judge, maybe even disapprove." I glanced at her then, at the quiet conflict written in the line of her brow. "But when I'm with you, none of that feels as important as this, as us." She exhaled, her shoulders lowering just slightly, but the tension remained. "I've spent so much of my life being careful, protecting myself. I can't help but wonder if letting this happen is selfish, if it's unfair to you." Her words struck deeper than I expected, not because they pushed me away, but because they revealed just how much she was holding back, how afraid she was of breaking something fragile before it could fully exist. I stepped closer, not touching her yet, but near enough that the space between us thinned. "It doesn't feel unfair to me. It feels honest, and I don't want to walk away from that." For a long moment, she didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on the river, though I could see the struggle in them, the push and pull between desire and fear. When my hand brushed against hers at her side, I half expected her to pull away, but she didn't. Her fingers hesitated, then slowly curled into mine, as if she was testing the strength of something unseen. The touch was small, almost tentative, but it carried more weight than any words we'd spoken. I felt her hand tremble slightly, and when she tightened her grip, a quiet certainty passed between us. We stood there in silence, hands joined, the river carrying its endless current below. And though neither of us had solved the questions that hung in the air, in that moment we chose not to let them break us. I almost thought she might disappear from my life altogether after that night. Days passed in silence, and though I told myself not to expect anything more, I couldn't quiet the ache of her absence. I found myself retracing familiar places, the bookshop, the cafe, even the park where the rain had caught us, as if by walking those paths I could summon her back. When she finally called, her voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Could we meet?" she asked. "No explanation, no detalles. Just those words." I didn't hesitate. We met at a small square in the city, the kind of place that looks ordinary in daylight but transforms at night. The street lamps glowed with a golden hue, and the autumn air carried a chill that made me tuck my hands into my pockets as I walked. She was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a tree whose branches were half bare, the leaves scattered around her like fragments of a season passing. She looked up when I approached, and in her eyes I saw something fragile, something restless. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, far enough to respect the uncertainty in her posture. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice low. "Thinking about us." She exhaled, a faint tremor in the sound. "And every time I do, I hear this voice in my head telling me to stop. That it's foolish. That people will talk. That I'll only get hurt." Her words settled heavily between us. I stayed quiet, letting her speak. "But then," she continued, her tone deepening, "there's another voice. One that says if I let this go, if I let you go, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her hand clenched slightly in her lap, and then she turned to me, her eyes unflinching. There was no smile this time, no attempt at hiding behind composure. Just honesty, raw and piercing. "You can walk away now," she said, each word deliberate, steady. "But you'll regret it forever." The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. The sounds of the square, distant footsteps, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of passing cars, all faded, leaving only the weight of her words. My chest tightened. For weeks I had been caught in the push and pull of her presence, never knowing if she would let me close or retreat behind her walls. And now, here she was placing the choice directly in my hands. I shifted slightly closer, my shoulder brushing hers. She didn't move away. Her breath hitched, subtle but telling, and I felt the warmth of her body beside mine, alive and trembling with uncertainty. I didn't answer right away. I just let the silence hold us, because I wanted her to feel the depth of what she had just given me, trust, vulnerability, and a truth she could no longer keep hidden. And in that silence, I knew I wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever. Her words lingered between us, still echoing in the night air. "You can walk away now, but you'll regret it forever." I sat there, the silence stretching, both of us caught in its weight. And then, slowly, deliberately, I reached across the space that had divided us for too long. My hand found hers, resting lightly at first, giving her time to pull away if she chose. But she didn't. Her fingers trembled against mine, then curled gently, as though accepting something she had been resisting for far too long. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw the absence of walls. No guarded composure, no carefully measured distance, just her stripped bare of pretense, waiting to see if I would stay. "I'm not walking away," I said quietly. The words weren't grand or dramatic, but they felt truer than anything I'd ever spoken. She exhaled then, a shaky breath that carried relief and something deeper, release. Her shoulders dropped, and with them, the weight she had been carrying seemed to ease. I shifted closer until our arms touched fully. She leaned into me, hesitating only for a heartbeat before letting her head rest lightly against my chest. The warmth of her body pressed into mine, and I could feel the rhythm of her breath, uneven at first, then gradually steadying. The world around us continued. The rustle of leaves, the faint hum of distant traffic, the glow of lamplight painting gold across the pavement. But within that small circle of closeness, everything else faded. All I felt was her, the weight of her against me, the scent of her hair, the quiet strength and fragility that coexisted in her presence. I wrapped an arm around her, pulling her gently closer. She didn't resist. Instead, her hand lifted to rest against my chest. Her fingers splayed lightly as if grounding herself in the certainty of my heartbeat. For a long time, we stayed that way, saying nothing. Words felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. The silence was no longer heavy, no longer something she feared. Now it was gentle, comforting, a silence shared. Eventually, she tilted her face up toward mine, her eyes shimmering in the lamplight. She didn't kiss me, not then. She didn't need to. Instead, she pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, her lips lingering just long enough for me to feel the warmth radiating long after she pulled back. It was enough, more than enough. In that quiet square, beneath the fading autumn leaves, I realized we had crossed the line between what could have been and what would be. Not a reckless fire, but a steady flame, the kind that warms slowly, deeply, refusing to burn out. As I held her close, I knew this wasn't just the end of hesitation. It was the beginning of something real. Something worth carrying, worth protecting. And for the first time, I didn't wonder about regret. I knew, with her beside me, I would never feel it.